Hello everyone, it's Robin the Delta Crafter, and I want to thank you for joining me for another video on my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about shadow stamping. Shadow stamping is a technique that we can use with some of our stamps that will allow us to get a little more versatility out of them. So let's take a look at what we're going to be using. So I'm going to be using the Sunny Lane stamp set from scrapbook.com, and in particular I want to use some of the solid stamps that are in this stamp set. This technique works best with a MISTI or some sort of stamping platform. To do our stamping, we're going to use the latest distress ink color called Lost Shadow. And then we're going to bring in a couple of other distress ink colors. We're going to break those up into groups of 3. So we're going to be using Carved Pumpkin, Mustard Seed, and Tumbled Glass for one set. Then we're going to use Spun Sugar, Picked Raspberry, and Wilted Violet for another combination. And for our final combination, we're going to use Ripe Persimmon, Villainous Potion, and then we're going to bring in that mustard seed for this combination as well. Let's get started with this technique. So first thing that you're going to want to do is choose the stamp that you're going to do this technique with. This technique works best with solid stamps. So in this Sunny Lane set from scrapbook.com, there are several solid stamps to choose from. But of course, this will work with any solid stamp that you have in your stash. I'm going to be stamping out this technique on some Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 80-pound cardstock, and I've already cut mine down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I keep a lot of these panels on the side of me so that when I'm ready to do some card making, especially in A2 size, I have them already pre-cut and ready to go. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this panel into my MISTI. You can place it in the stamping platform that you make. So I'm going to place that panel in my MISTI with my portrait orientation. So I've kind of figured out exactly where I want my stamp, and I'm going to stamp down a first layer of the image with using the Lost Shadow Distress ink. Gray ink would work with this technique, but you want to make sure that you use some sort of really light color for this first layer, because what we're doing is we're going to offset the stamp and create a shadow with that stamp. So I've stamped my first image, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to move my panel up 1.5 inches. So the top of the panel was at 5 1/2. Now I've moved it up to 7, and which will work great with the size of the stamp that I have. If you were to do this technique, you would need to figure out what position or how far you need to move your panel up according to the size of your stamp. For this stamp, 1.5 inches works great. And it just so happens that I have another 1.5 inches left of space in my MISTI, so I can move my panel up all the way to the top. So I'm going to do that, and I'm going to ink up my stamp and stamp this image down for a 3rd time. Now keep in mind that distress inks are dye inks, and what dye inks do is they dye the paper. So yes, the ink may look a little bit splotchy right now, but we're going to give this time to dry and to settle into the paper, and a lot of that splotchiness will go away. So as I bring it up closer for a closer view, you can see there are some splotchy spots. Nothing for us to worry about, especially because this is our shadow layer. So if we don't get the greatest coverage, it's no concern, because we're going to be stamping on top of this layer anyway. So while I have this setup going and I have my gray ink out, I'm just going to go ahead and make several of these panels, and so that I can have those to ink with our different color combinations on top of. So you can see there I've made 4 of the panels, and we're going to use those next to add our color to this stamping. So now I'm going to bring one of those panels back into my MISTI. Another reason why we want to use some sort of stamping platform is because once we get our stamp set, as we saw with the gray, when we were stamping the gray images, we can just move our paper around instead of having to move our stamp around. So you can see here I've laid my stamp precisely on top of where I stamped it before. And what I did just then was move it slightly to the right. You can decide if you want your shadow to be on the left of your image or to the right of your image. I like the shadow on the left of the image, which means I need to move my stamp to the right. So now I'm going to bring in these first set of three distress inks. I'm going to start in with the carved pumpkin, and I'm going to ink up my image and stamp that on top of the gray image. Now, because this is our colored ink, we can stamp this as many times as we want. I chose not to do that with the gray because I really didn't want the gray to be like super dark. Because we know the more that we stamp an image, ink up an image and stamp it, the darker the color will get. Well, we really didn't want that with the shadow layer. We just want a faint hint of that shadow back behind our colored layer. So I've added the carved pumpkin, and now I'm going to go in with our second color, mustard seed. So I'm going to ink up my image, ink up my stamp, and then while I'm inking up the stamp, I'm going to move my paper up to the 7. So the same 7-inch mark rather. So the same process that I used for the first time to create the gray stamps, we're going to use those same measurements to create our colored stamped images. So I'm going to stamp this mustard seed again. And then I've decided to stamp this image a third time with the mustard seed. That's going to be our final time with that color. Then we're going to move on to our final color, tumbled glass. So I'm inking up my image one last time. And then I'm going to move my panel up to the 8.5 mark. So again, for my image, I needed to move it 1.5 inches each time I move the panel. Stamp that down the first time, stamp it a second time, and a third time. Third time's the charm. So now let's take a look at this panel, take a closer look at it. So you can see a gray shadow behind our colored stamped images. So I'm just going to go through the other sets of ink colors that we have, and I'm going to repeat this same process. This can be, if you want to create several panels, a very repetitive process, which can be a good thing if you need to make a lot of cards at one time. If you want to mass create a bunch of cards, this will be a great technique to use for mass creating a bunch of cards. So you can see here I've got 4 panels. One of them I made ahead of time before filming the video. I've got 4 completed panels that I'm ready to make my cards with. So while I was creating that last panel, I had an epiphany, and I was like, well, what would happen if I was to use a bunch of colors instead of gray? So I chose to jump into my Pink Fresh Studio inks. The reason why I chose to jump into my Pink Fresh Studio inks for this is because the Pink Fresh Studio inks are created in quads. So for each color, there are 4 shades or tones of that color. You'll see an example here shortly of where I use one color, but I use all 4 shades of that color to do this technique. And then what I'm doing here is I'm using the lightest shade of 6 different colors. So those lightest shades all complement each other and work really well together. So this kind of is going to end up looking like, especially with this stamp, it's going to give us that retro vibe that's kind of come back around, that stacked lettering vibe. So I went in first with my coral reef, and then I'm going to, in order to create this kind of stacked or rainbow retro vibe and effect, I'm going to move my panel up 1/4 inch. Up 1/4 inch and to the left 1/4 inch. So now I'm coming in with my peach fuzz, and now I'm going to stamp that on top of my coral reef, but not directly on top, just a little bit offset. So we can see how this is going to come together. So I'm going to do the same thing with the remaining colors that I pulled from my Pink Fresh Studio ink stash and just continue down the line. Some of them I may stamp once, some of them I may stamp twice. So again, I'm moving up 1/4 inch or 1 box, and I move to the left 1 box. So we got that lemon whip, the ocean breeze. The blue color is called slumber, and the light lavender color is called lilac. So here's what this technique looks like when you use several different colors of ink. I'm really loving the retro vibe that this panel is giving. So off camera, I went ahead and trimmed down all of the panels. How you use this technique will determine how you need to trim down your panels, because you can see here that not all my panels are the same size. So to go to the next step of creating this card, I decided to go ahead and pop up each panel using some foam tape. 2 of the panels will get mounted on a piece of colored cardstock. So if you look at that panel in the top right corner, that's the panel I mentioned earlier where I said I used 4 shades of the same color. And I really like this effect. It's given again that retro vibe, and I really like the way that came together. So I went ahead and peeled off all the backers from the foam tape and mounted these panels onto our card bases. Our card bases are made from accent opaque 120-pound weight cardstock. If you're interested, you can find products in the description box below. Now we could have stopped right there with these cards. These could be really simple, quick cards to make. But I decided to take them a little bit further by adding a little bit of embellishment to a couple of the cards. Not all of them, but some of them kind of were screaming for a little bit of glitz and glam. So I brought in a mix from the Diary of Belle Rose, as well as some embellishments from Pink Fresh Studio. So I'm just going to dot some of these embellishments around a couple of cards, and then we're going to call these cards complete. Let's take a closer look at the card that we created. So here we have the first stamping technique that we use, the shadow with just the gray ink. And you can really see the gray shadow behind the colored stamped images. So these first 2 cards are just simple cards. So if you had to make cards for Teachers Appreciation Week, or a function for your church, or you just wanted to have a lot of cards on hand, this is a great technique to use where you can make a lot of cards quickly without a whole lot of effort. So we're moving into the embellished cards, and I really like the finished touch that these aqua gems give this card. And again, here's that card that I made with the quad of colored ink. So the 4 tones of the same color. This one just might be my favorite. It's a tie between this one and the rainbow colored one. If you have a favorite card, please let me know in the comments below. I'd love to know what you think of this technique. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to the channel. As always, you'll find all the products listed and linked below, as well as on the coordinating blog post. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at The Delta Crafter, as well as at my blog, thedeltacrafter.com. Until next time, everyone, have a wonderful day. Enjoy!